call to order this second joint hearing of the Rules and Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committees on examining the January 6th attack on the United States Capitol. At today's hearing, we will continue our committee's important work to get answers that will lead us to solutions following the horrific events at this Capitol on January 6th. Last week, we heard from witnesses who were directly in charge of Capitol security on that day and from local law enforcement in Washington. Today, we'll hear testimony from the head of the D.C. National Guard and from federal officials from agencies including FBI, Defense Department, and Department of Homeland Security that are tasked with supporting our security people at the Capitol. The testimony of these witnesses is crucial as we work to get to the bottom of what happened, again, with the focus being on making sure it doesn't happen again. And with that, I now turn it over to Chairman Peters for his opening statement. I will give mine, then Senator Blunt and Portman. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Ranking Member Portman, Ranking Member Blunt, and to all of our colleagues from the Rules Committee for once again joining us to convene this second joint hearing on the January 6th attack on our Capitol building. Last week's hearing provided really the first opportunity for the American people to hear about the attack directly from the security officials that were on the ground. Today we'll be seeking answers on the role of the federal national security and counterterrorism agencies and officials played in intelligence gathering, security planning, and response to the attack. And I want to thank each of our witnesses for joining us voluntarily here today, and I'm grateful to all of you and the employees of each of your agencies, including the National Guard units, who continue to assist in protecting the Capitol today. We appreciate their continued efforts to safeguard our national security. And while there are still many unanswered questions about January 6th, it's clear that this violent, coordinated attack was the result of a massive and historic intelligence failure. Today, our committees will once again examine the systemic breakdowns that led to this terrible attack, and particularly how our intelligence and national security experts failed to see it coming. This is not a new problem. For years, I've been raising the alarm about the growing domestic terrorism threat with the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and other key agencies, and their continued failures to adequately and effectively align our counterterrorism efforts to address the threats posed by domestic extremists. But the January 6th attack must mark a turning point. There can be no question that the domestic terrorist threat, including violence driven by white supremacist and anti-government groups, is the gravest terrorist threat to our homeland security. Moving forward, the FBI, which is tasked with leading our counterterrorism efforts, and the Department of Homeland Security, which ensures that state and local law enforcement understands the threats that American communities face, must address this deadly threat with the same focus and resources and analytical rigor that they apply to foreign threats such as ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Today's witnesses are uniquely qualified to discuss the intelligence that was produced in the days leading up to the attack that officials missed as they assessed the likelihood of violence on that day, and why our intelligence community failed to heed the crystal clear warnings that were broadcast on social media and publicly reported in the days leading up to the 6th, that a violent attack on the Capitol was likely and imminent. We also need answers about the operational failures that terrible day, especially the response to secure the building once it was breached. I'm pleased that we have representatives of both the Department of Defense civilian leadership and the National Guard to help us understand why it took several hours for the National Guard to arrive and offer additional security and support. The January 6th attack on the citadel of our democracy remains a dark stain on our nation's history. Our committee, both of our committees, have a responsibility to carry out our oversight duties in a serious and nonpartisan way. I look forward to having a productive discussion and getting the answers that the American people deserve, and what we need to do to make sure that reforms are put in place to prevent an attack like this from ever happening again. With that, I will turn it back over to Chairwoman Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to start by thanking you and Ranking Member Blunt, Ranking Member Portman, for the bipartisan and constructive hearing that we had last week. I also want to thank the many members of both committees that patiently participated during votes and all last week and asked thoughtful questions that will help us move forward. Importantly, there were a number of areas of agreement. We heard all of our witnesses last week make clear that there is now evidence that the insurrection was deliberate and coordinated, that it involved white supremacists and extremist groups, and that it was highly dangerous but could have been so much worse if it was not for the actions of brave law enforcement on the front line. We also heard consensus from witnesses who held key leadership positions in charge of the Capitol security. Now, they didn't agree on everything, but there was consensus. There were breakdowns in intelligence sharing, delays in bringing in the National Guard, and issues concerning the structure of the Capitol Police Board and the decision-making process that it is in our unique responsibility to change. I hope that the spirit of bipartisanship and cooperation will continue today as we hear testimony from federal agencies on their roles with respect to intelligence gathering and timely sharing of intelligence, security preparations, the response, and the request for help from the Defense Department, as well as their perspectives on how the Capitol Police decision-making process could be so much better going forward. We know that there were errors made by those in charge of security in the Capitol, and it is always easy, of course, to realize that later than we're in the moment. But that fact alone, to me, isn't enough to not look back. We must look back because we must do better going forward. We heard last week that the Capitol Police is a consumer, that was the word of the former chief, of intelligence. It relies on its federal partners, including the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security, who have witnesses here today. While we are aware of the FBI raw intelligence report that came out the day before out of the Norfolk office, public reporting has indicated that neither agency, DHS or FBI, produced a threat report, that the FBI did not produce a joint intelligence bulletin, and the DHS did not produce a threat assessment ahead of January 6th. And the former police chief has said that representatives from these agencies indicated they didn't have any new intelligence to share at a meeting before the day of the attack. But the insurrectionists who attacked the Capitol, as we know, came prepared for war, as we heard last week. They brought radios, they brought climbing gear to surmount the Capitol's security features, and they brought weapons. So we need to hear from the federal agencies about what was known and when, what was done in response to these foreboding online threats, and how information was shared with the law enforcement partners who depend on them. We need to also understand why, with all the information that was available, the decision to reinforce local police with the National Guard was not made ahead of time. Now, that decision was made, or maybe I should say rather not made, by the former House and Senate Sergeant-at-Arms, who in fact have resigned. And nevertheless, despite the clear breakdowns at the Capitol, we must get to the bottom of why that very day it took the Defense Department so long to deploy the National Guard once the need for reinforcements became patently clear on every TV screen in America. At our hearing last week, Acting Chief Conti provided a disturbing account of how at 2:22 p.m., as the rioters already had broken through police lines, smashed windows at the Capitol, and were breaching the building, all on live television, the initial response from the Defense Department to a request of National Guard support was not to immediately activate the Guard. As the acting chief said to us last week, he was, quote, simply just stunned that there was not a more immediate response. Last, an issue of critical importance in today's hearing is the threat posed by domestic terrorism and hate groups and their role in the attack on January 6th. We will never forget the story of the Capitol Police officer who fought against the violent mob for hours and after it was all over, broke down in tears, telling his fellow officers how he'd been called the N-word repeatedly that day and then said, is this America? We also won't forget the picture of the insurrectionists proudly waving a Confederate flag in the Capitol Rotunda, or the images of a rioter in a Camp Auschwitz hoodie. But this rising problem is not just limited to the events on January 6th. According to an FBI report, hate crimes in the U.S. rose to the highest level in more than a decade in 2019. Putting all the dates and the memos aside, there was widespread knowledge of the importance of the date, of the rise of violent extremism, and that the President of the United States had called out his followers to go to the Capitol that day. The warnings were dismissed, despite the fact that the Vice President, the future Vice President, and the entire Congress was gathered in one place. In the end, it was left to frontline officers who were severely outnumbered to protect not only those of us in the Capitol, but our democracy itself. They performed heroically under unimaginable circumstances, tragically suffering many injuries and loss of life. That's why we need answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar and Senator Peters, Ranking Member Blunt, for the way you all have approached this process. It's important that we keep it bipartisan, I would even say nonpartisan, and I hope that our review continues to set politics aside and focus on the facts. What happened that day, and how can we avoid it happening again? I want to begin by expressing again my gratitude to law enforcement, and National Guard is represented here today from all over the country. Their National Guard here in the Capitol still, and we appreciate them. We appreciate the fact that law enforcement put their safety on the line to safeguard democracy, and also to protect us, and we will never forget that. We owe it to those law enforcement personnel and those National Guard and to all Americans to take a hard look at these security failures, both the preparation that was inadequate, clearly, and the response, which also had some gaps we'll talk about in a moment. How could this have happened, that the Capitol was breached and overrun? We got some answers last week at our first joint hearing on the Capitol. I agree with what Senator Klobuchar just said, that it was a constructive first hearing. I thought it was productive, and I thought we were able to get some good information. We heard from the acting Chief of D.C. Metropolitan Police, the former Chief of Capitol Police, the former Sergeant at Arms. What was good is that we heard from the people who were actually responsible on that day for making decisions. I'm concerned that today we're not going to be hearing from the Department of Defense officials who were actually in place at the time making the decisions, and I hope we'll have an opportunity to do that in the future. At last week's hearing, we learned a number of things. We learned that Capitol police officers were not prepared to respond to an attack like the one we experienced on January 6th. They were not given the appropriate training or equipment necessary to protect the Capitol complex, but also to protect themselves. Also, we learned there were breakdowns in communication on January 6th and in the days leading up to it. The most concerning breakdown in communication, of course, concerned the significant discrepancies between the recollections of the former Chief of Capitol Police and the former Senate and House Sergeant at Arms about requests for backup for National Guard assistance in particular. Each testified under oath to a different version of requests of events. So we'll get to the bottom of that. The witnesses also pointed to lapses in intelligence as a key reason law enforcement was not better prepared. They all claimed no intelligence warned of a coordinated violent assault of the Capitol, but we know that there were reports out there, both publicly and from the FBI. There was at least one report from the FBI Norfolk Field Office warning of a violent attack on the Capitol. It was received by U.S. Capitol Police, but it never reached the former chief. It never reached the former Sergeant at Arms, or even the incident commanders on the ground. Many questions remain unanswered. Despite the lack of intelligence, there were warning signs. Numerous online posts called for attacking the Capitol, and the previously mentioned FBI Norfolk Field report warned of violence and even war. We need to know what information the intelligence community reviewed prior to January 6, how it assessed that intelligence, and how it characterized the potential for violence when it shared that intelligence with law enforcement. Second, although last week's witnesses disagreed about when the Capitol Police requested National Guard assistance, all agreed that once requested, it took far too long for the National Guard to arrive. We'll dig further into this today. Based on the Defense Department's public timeline, once requested, it took the National Guard over 3 hours to arrive at the Capitol. Now, remember, we're all watching this on CNN and Fox and MSNBC, and it's a riot. And yet, it took more than 3 hours. The request came in from the Capitol Hill Police Chief Sund at 1:49 p.m., we're told, and the Capitol Hill deployment did not arrive until after 5 p.m. We'll hear some different timelines on that today, but all of them are after 5 p.m., closer to 5:30. So why did that happen? It's unclear when senior defense officials authorized the National Guard to deploy. The Defense Department's public timeline states that Army Secretary McCarthy directed the D.C. National Guard to mobilize at 3:04 p.m. But according to the timeline the National Guard provided to the committees and a briefing from Major General Walker, Commanding General of the D.C. National Guard, the instruction to deploy didn't arrive until 5:08 p.m. We need to know why the Pentagon took so long to deploy the National Guard. According to the former Chief of Capitol Police and acting Chief of D.C. Police and Major General Walker, the delay was due in part to concerns about the, quote, optics of the National Guard at the Capitol. We need to know what role, if any, optics played in the delay to provide much-needed assistance to U.S. Capitol Police and D.C. Metropolitan Police Department to protect the Capitol and to get people out of the Capitol. By hearing from representatives of the federal agencies responsible for the intelligence and the National Guard, today we expect to get clear answers to these open questions. Answering these questions is critical to our understanding of where the breakdowns occurred on and before January 6th, and only by understanding where the breakdowns occurred can we make the changes necessary to ensure that something like January 6th never happens again. And that's our objective here with this oversight mission. Again, I appreciate the fact that we've been able to keep the politics out of this and focus on the facts and be objective. We have to continue to do that. I look forward to another constructive hearing today. Thanks to our witnesses for being here. I look forward to your testimony.
Recognizes Senator Blunt for your ranking member Blunt for your opening comments.
Thank you, Chairman Peters, and thanks to Chairwoman Klobuchar. I join my good friend Senator Portman with my appreciation for where we've headed with this so far, and my hope that we continue to look at the facts and see where the facts lead us in as much of a nonpartisan way as you can do in an institution like the United States Senate. I'm glad to join my colleagues for today's hearing to learn more about the decisions and the actions of federal agencies on January the 6th. Last week's hearing with the chief of the Metropolitan Police Force, the former chief of the Capitol Police, and the former sergeants at arms of the House and Senate really left in many ways with more questions and answers. The witnesses could not agree on some of the basics of a timeline. I believe we learned at that hearing that the structure and the practice of the Capitol Police Board, which I previously questioned, in fact asked for a GAO study that was issued in 2017, just simply delayed the response and proved to be ill-suited for an emergency on the 6th. Today, I hope to learn if the failure of Capitol security leaders were compounded by officials at the Department of Defense who did not act quickly enough to take the situation seriously enough. I also hope to explore if the failure to alert the leadership of the U.S. Capitol Police or the Metropolitan Police Department of the FBI's Norfolk Situation Information Report, which warned of, quote, war, end quotes, at the Capitol. And I understand that that information was raw and unverified, but should it make us consider changes in the information sharing process that we pursue in this structure? All of the agencies participate in these hearings at the most fundamental level exist to uphold and protect the rights of Americans and to protect our form of government. January 6th revealed weaknesses in our intelligence agencies, our law enforcement agencies, and elements of defense agencies. It would be a mistake for the leadership of those agencies to think it was only a failure of the U.S. Capitol Police leadership. or the Capitol Police Board that produced the terrible result we saw that day. I look forward to the testimony of our witnesses, and again, thanks for holding this hearing, Chairman Peters.
It's now my privilege to introduce each of the witnesses that we will be hearing from here today. And again, thank you for your willingness to be with us. Our first witness today is Ms. Melissa Smyslova. Ms. Slova is currently the Acting Undersecretary for the Office of Intelligence and Analysis at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. Ms. Slova is the Principal Advisor to the Secretary of Homeland Security and the Deputy Secretary of Homeland Security for coordinating with law enforcement officials and intelligence to respond to terrorism and other threats that the nation faces. She assumed this role on January 20th, 2021. Prior to that date, and on January 6th, Ms. Smyslova was the Deputy Undersecretary of the Office of Intelligence and Analysis. Prior to joining DHS, she spent almost 20 years in the field of intelligence analysis, which included time at the Defense Intelligence Agency. Welcome. Our second witness is Ms. Jill Sanborn. Since January 2020, Ms. Sanborn has served as the Assistant Director of the FBI's Counterterrorism Division, where she helps lead the FBI's efforts to provide information on terrorists and track down known terrorists worldwide. Ms. Sanborn first joined the FBI in 1998 and was assigned to the Phoenix Field Office. Prior to becoming Assistant Director, Ms. Sanborn served as the Special Agent in charge of the Minneapolis FBI Field Office, was detailed to the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, and worked in both the Washington and Los Angeles field offices. Welcome. Our third witness is Mr. Robert Salesis. Mr. Salesis is currently performing the duties of Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and Global Security, which he began on January 20th of 2021. Prior to this, and on January 6, 2021, he was the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense Integration and Defense Support of Civil Authorities. In this role, Mr. Salesis worked closely with federal, state, and local leadership, law enforcement, public health, and emergency management to oversee DoD's response to national emergency operations in support of civil authorities, including the deployment of the National Guard. Mr. Salesis was appointed to the Senior Executive Service in 2005. He was awarded the Presidential Rank Award at the rank of Meritorious Executive for his decisive leadership and program management skills and his contributions to the National Response Plan and the National Strategy for Homeland Security. Welcome. Our final witness today is Major General William Walker, the Commanding General of the D.C. National Guard. In this role, General Walker is responsible for the strategic leadership, training, readiness, operational employment, and performance of the Army and Air Force components of the D.C. National Guard. He reports to the Secretary of the Army and is charged with ensuring units are manned, trained, equipped, and ready for war and any national emergency. For 30 years, General Walker served as both a National Guardsman and a special agent of the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration. Welcome, General. Chairman Klobuchar, those are our witnesses for today.
Thank you. Thank you, Chairman Peters. If the witnesses could now please stand and raise your right hand. Do you swear that the testimony that you will give before the committee is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You can be seated, and I'll turn it back over to Chairman Peters.
I think we will now begin with the questioning. What's that?
Your statements.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, I'm sorry. Ms. Salesis, I think you are first for your opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman. Chairman Peters, Chairwoman Klobuchar, Ranking Members Portman and Blunt, distinguished members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today on the Department of Defense's support of civilian law enforcement agencies in securing the U.S. Capitol on January 6, 2021. One of DoD's missions is to support civil authorities, including civilian law enforcement organizations. DoD frequently provides this support during planned major events, like the presidential inauguration and the State of the Union addresses. Due to the unique nature of the District of Columbia, in which numerous governmental organizations exercise a range of jurisdictional authorities, ensuring safety and security is the responsibility of the D.C. government, the Secret Service, the Park Police, the Marshal Service, the Capitol Police, the Federal Protective Service, and other civilian law enforcement organizations. DoD provides support to these civilian law enforcement agencies when requested based on their assessment of the support required. Prior to the attack of January 6, DoD worked closely with federal law enforcement, D.C. government partners to determine if they anticipated a need for any DoD or D.C. National Guard support related to the planned protests. On 31 December, the commanding general of D.C. National Guard received a letter from the D.C. government requesting National Guard support for the D.C. Metro Police at 30 traffic control points and 6 metro stations, and to make available the D.C. National Guard Civil Support Team to support the D.C. Fire and Emergency Services. Over the weekend of January 2nd and 3rd, my staff contacted the Secret Service, the Park Police, the Marshal Service, the FBI, the Capitol Police, to determine if they plan to request DoD assistance. None of these law enforcement agencies indicated a need for DoD or D.C. National Guard support. After consultation with the Department of Justice, the Acting Secretary of Defense approved the D.C. government request for National Guard personnel to support 30 traffic control points and 6 metro stations from January 5th to the 6th. The Acting Secretary also authorized a 40-person quick reaction force to be readied at Joint Base Andrews. On January 5th, the Acting Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of the Army received a letter from the Mayor of D.C. stating MPD is prepared and coordinated with its federal partners, namely the Park Police, the Capitol Police, and the Secret Service. Based on these communications with federal and local civilian authorities, DoD determined that no additional military support was required on January 5th and 6th. DoD has detailed the events of 6 January 2021 in a memorandum published on defense.gov. I will provide a summary of those key events. After the U.S. Capitol Police ordered the evacuation of the Capitol complex, the Secretary of the Army and the Commanding General of the D.C. National Guard received calls shortly before 2 p.m. from the Mayor of D.C. and the Capitol Police Chief, respectively. At approximately 2:30 p.m., the Secretary of the Army met with the Acting Secretary of Defense and other senior leaders of the Defense Department. After this meeting, the Acting Secretary of Defense determined that all available forces of the D.C. National Guard were required to reinforce the D.C. Metropolitan Police and the U.S. Capitol Police, and ordered the full mobilization of the D.C. National Guard at 3:04 p.m. During this period, Major General Walker, the Commanding General of the D.C. National Guard, recalled and made ready the D.C. National Guard forces at the National Guard Armory for deployment to the Capitol complex. After reviewing the D.C. National Guard's missions, equipping, and responsibilities to be performed at the Capitol complex in support of the Metropolitan Police and Capitol Police, and conferring with the D.C. Metropolitan Police at their headquarters at 4:10 p.m., the Secretary of the Army received the Acting Secretary of Defense's approval at 4:32 and ordered the D.C. National Guard forces to depart the Armory for the Capitol complex. DoD continued to deploy National Guard forces through the evening to support the U.S. Capitol. By 9 o'clock on 7 January, 1,100 National Guard personnel had arrived at the Capitol. By 9 o'clock on 8 January, 1,800 National Guard personnel had arrived at the Capitol. And by 10 January, 6,000 National Guard personnel were at the Capitol providing security. DoD continues to support efforts to protect the safety and security of the U.S. Capitol and provide support to our civilian law enforcement partners. From January 9 through the inauguration, DoD provided nearly 25,000 National Guard personnel to support security in Washington, D.C. Today, there are approximately 4,900 National Guard personnel supporting Capitol Police and 500 supporting the Metropolitan Police. Going forward, the Department of Defense is committed to working closely with our federal, state, and local law enforcement partners, the D.C. government, and the Congress to ensure that we learn from this event and take all necessary actions to respond and ensure an attack on our nation's capital never happens again. Chairman Peters, Chairwoman Klobuchar, Ranking Member Portman and Blunt, distinguished members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today, and thank you for your continued commitment and support to the men and women of the Department of Defense.
Ms. Smysova, you are now recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Senator. Good morning, Chairman Peters, Chairwoman Klobuchar, Ranking Member Portman, Ranking Member Blunt, and other distinguished senators. Thank you for the opportunity for me to testify with you today. I want to start with saying I am deeply saddened by the terrifying events that you, your staff, your loved ones, and others experienced on January 6th. The country, myself included, watched in horror as our Capitol was attacked. I am here today as the Acting Undersecretary for the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, INA, at DHS. I am a career intelligence professional of over 35 years. I am honored to have this opportunity to lead INA. I have great faith in the workforce and in our mission, which is to focus on a range of homeland threats, including domestic terrorism, and ensuring that our partners across state, local, private sector have the information they need. Before I summarize the actions my office took before January 6th, I do want to say I'm deeply concerned that despite our best efforts, they did not lead to an operational response to prepare and defend the U.S. Capitol. Throughout the 2020 election period and the presidential transition, INA produced numerous strategic assessments about the potential for election-related violence from domestic violent extremists. In 15 unclassified assessments, INA discussed the heightened threat environment and the potential for domestic violent extremists to mobilize quickly and attack large gatherings or government buildings. These products were intended to increase awareness about the volatile threat environment and enhance both policy and operational planning. They were shared broadly with all levels of government, law enforcement partners, critical infrastructure, including through fusion centers nationwide. I will highlight a few products and engagements. In August, INA published an assessment on physical threats stemming from the 2020 election, in which we assessed ideologically motivated violent extremists and other violent actors could quickly mobilize to threaten or engage in violence against election or campaign-related targets in response to perceived partisan and policy-based grievances. In October, DHS released its first publicly available Homeland Threat Assessment, which stated racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists, specifically white supremacists, would remain the most persistent and lethal threat in the homeland. The assessment also emphasized the breadth of the domestic violent extremist threat, including the heightened threats from election-related violence. A week before the attack, on December 30th, INA co-authored an intelligence product with the FBI and the National Counterterrorism Center, highlighting persistent threats to government facilities and law enforcement, noting the perceptions of the outcome of the election could mobilize some extremists to commit violence in the coming months. Additionally, INA proactively conducted briefings and stakeholder calls before and after the election and leading up to January 6th to share that information. Moving forward, I want to underscore the department is prioritizing combating domestic terrorism. Specifically, in INA, we're working very closely with our DHS colleagues in the Civil Rights, Civil Liberties Office, Privacy Office, and our own Intelligence Oversight Office to carefully examine how we can better address the complex and evolving threat in the manner consistent with the Constitution and U.S. law. My office is committed to developing more expertise on domestic terrorism, improving our analysis of social media to better characterize the threat, and ensuring our assessments are received and understood by key decision makers. Additionally, the department has taken these steps since January 6th. In late January, DHS issued our first National Terrorism Advisory System Bulletin on domestic terrorism. It warned domestic violent extremists may be emboldened to act in the wake of the U.S. Capitol breach. Domestic violent extremists, which span a diverse set of ideological actors, including racially and ethnically motivated extremists, will continue to exploit lawful, constitutionally protected protests and other events to pursue criminal behavior and commit acts of violence. Also, for the first time, Secretary Mayorkas designated domestic violent extremists as a national priority area within the department's Homeland Security grant. Let me close by saying my colleagues in INA and across DHS are unwavering in our commitment to ensuring the department is well positioned to combat this evolving threat and protect the American people. Thank you for your opportunity to appear before you today. I welcome your questions.
Thank you. Ms. Sanborn, you're now recognized for your opening comments.
Good morning, Chairwoman Klobuchar, Ranking Member Blunt, Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Portman, and the members of the committees. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Jill Sanborn, and I'm the Assistant Director for the Counterterrorism Division within the FBI. It is always an honor to be here with you in the Senate. For those of you that I haven't met or you don't know, I actually started my career in public service as a Senate page in 1987, thanks to a sponsorship from my home senator, Senator Max Baucus. I want to start by offering my condolences to all of you who had to endure up close and personally the violence and destruction that occurred on January 6th. The siege on the Capitol complex, while you were carrying out your duties as our elected representatives, was not just unacceptable and disturbing, it was criminal. I also want to offer condolences to our partners at U.S. Capitol Police for the loss of one of their brothers, Officer Sicknick. This is a loss to us all in law enforcement. Violence designed to intimidate the population and influence the government is exactly what the FBI's Counterterrorism Division was designed to combat. The men and women of the FBI are not only dedicated to identifying and bringing to justice the individuals involved in the attack on January 6th, but also, and equally as important, and let me stress this, we're committed to working to prevent something like this from ever happening again. Over the last 2 months, the Americans you represent from across the country have sent in over 200,000 digital media tips and reported more than 30,000 leads to our National Threat Operations Center. With this support, we have identified hundreds of people involved in the attack and arrested more than 300, with more and more arrests every day. I want to reiterate something the director mentioned to some of your colleagues yesterday. As Americans, we are all victims of this assault, and the American people deserve nothing less than our commitment to see this investigation through and to protect them from acts of violence like this in the future. The FBI's #1 priority is preventing acts of terrorism. The greatest threat we face is the threat posed by lone actors, both domestic violent extremists and what we refer to as the homegrown violent extremists. These actors are especially challenging for law enforcement because by definition, their insular nature makes them particularly difficult to identify and disrupt before they have an opportunity to act. The FBI has been investigating domestic terrorism throughout our organization's history. However, today's threat is different than it was 100 years ago and continues to evolve. Between 2015 and 2020, racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists were responsible for the most lethal domestic terrorism threat. And in fact, 2019 was the most lethal year for domestic violent extremist attacks since the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. However, in 2020, 3 of the 4 fatal domestic violent extremist attacks were perpetrated by what we call anti-government or anti-authority violent extremists. One of those attacks was perpetrated by an anarchist violent extremist in Portland. And in fact, this was the first fatal anarchist violent extremist attack in over 20 years. 2020 also marked the first year since 2011 that there were no fatal attacks committed by the racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists advocating for the superiority of the white race. I think all of those explain how the threat is persistent and evolving. Looking forward, we assess the domestic violent extremist threat will continue to pose an elevated threat of violence to the U.S. We expect racially or ethnically motivated violent extremists and anti-government, anti-authority violent extremists will very likely pose the greatest domestic terrorism threats throughout 2021, and in fact, leading into 2022. Regardless of the specific perpetrator, the domestic terrorism threat remains persistent, and that is why we must remain focused on countering it. I want to take this opportunity to re-emphasize that the FBI's mission to uphold the Constitution and protect the American people is both dual and simultaneous and not contradictory. One does not come at the expense of the other. That said, when a person crosses the line from expressing beliefs to violating federal law and endangers the communities we serve, we aggressively pursue those threats. Before closing, I want to mention the importance of partnerships in the counterterrorism fight. We simply cannot be successful without them. Our investigations and disruptions rely on these partnerships, and they represent American lives saved in communities around the United States. For instance, in fiscal year 2020 alone, your JTTFs across the United States arrested 235 terrorism subjects. We also continue to expand our partnerships in academia, private sector, and within the communities we serve. This is critical because nearly half of our cases are predicated on tips and leads from the community and our law enforcement partners. We in law enforcement cannot and will not tolerate individuals who use the First Amendment as a guise to incite violence. That's true now, as we work hard to hold those accountable involved in the events on January 6th, just as it was last summer when individuals exploited peaceful protests as cover for their own violence and destruction. When violent extremists utilize explosive devices, attack government facilities and businesses, or target law enforcement officers, the FBI investigates those unlawful acts, regardless of the underlying ideological motivation. At the FBI, we work every threat with the same level of rigor and dedication, and that's what I hope you take away from my testimony today. Thank you again for an opportunity to talk with you about the hard work our folks and our partners are doing every day to keep the country safe. We are grateful for the support that you have provided and continue to provide the men and women of the FBI. I look forward to answering any of the questions you may have.
Thank you. General Walker, you are now recognized for your opening statement.
Good morning, Chairman Peters, Chairwoman Klobuchar, Ranking Members Portman and Blunt, and members of the committees. I am Major General William Walker, the Commanding General for the District of Columbia National Guard, affectionately known as Capitol Guardians. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the events of January 6th, a dark chapter in our nation's history. I was personally sickened by the violence and destruction I witnessed that fateful day and the physical and mental harm that came to U.S. Capitol Police officers and Metropolitan Police Department officers, some of whom I met with later that evening, and I could see the injuries that they sustained. It is my hope that my recollection of the events and my presentation of the facts as I know them will help your committees in its investigation and prevent such tragic events from ever occurring again. First, I think it's critical to understand what the District of Columbia National Guard mission was on January 6th to include the civilian agency we were supporting, and our requests for support of other civilian authorities were handled. On December 31st, 2020, the District of Columbia National Guard received written requests from the District of Columbia Mayor, Muriel Bowser, and her Director of Homeland Security and Emergency Management, Dr. Christopher Rodriguez. The request sought National Guard support for traffic control and crowd management for planned demonstrations in the district from January 5th through January 6, 2021. After conducting mission analysis to support the district's request, I sent a letter to the Secretary of the Army, Ryan McCarthy, on January 1st requesting his approval. I received that approval in a letter dated January 5th, granting support to the Metropolitan Police Department with a 320 Guardsmen personnel to include a 40-personnel quick reaction force. The District of Columbia National Guard provides support to the Metropolitan Police Department, the United States Park Police, the United States Secret Service, and other federal and district law enforcement agencies in response to planned rallies, marches, protests, and other large-scale First Amendment activity on a routine basis. A standard component of such support is the stand-up of an off-site quick reaction force, an element of Guardsmen held in reserve with civil disturbance response equipment, helmets, shields, batons, etc. They are postured to quickly respond to an urgent and immediate need for assistance by civil authorities. The Secretary of the Army's January 5th letter to me withheld that authority for me to employ a quick reaction force. Additionally, the Secretary of the Army's memorandum to me required that a concept of operation be submitted to him before the employment of a quick reaction force. I found that requirement to be unusual, as was the requirement to seek approval to move Guardsmen supporting the Metropolitan Police Department to move from one traffic control point to another. At 1:30 p.m. on January 6th, we watched as the Metropolitan Police Department began to employ officers to support the Capitol Police. In doing so, the officers began to withdraw from the traffic control points that were jointly manned with District of Columbia Guardsmen. At 1:49 p.m., I received a frantic call from then Chief of United States Capitol Police, Stephen Sun, where he informed me that the security perimeter of the United States Capitol had been breached by hostile rioters. Chief Sun, his voice cracking with emotion, indicated that there was a dire emergency at the Capitol, and he requested the immediate assistance of as many available National Guardsmen that I could muster. Immediately after that 1:49 call, I alerted the U.S. Army senior leadership of the request. The approval for Chief Sun's request would eventually come from the Acting Secretary of Defense and be relayed to me by Army senior leaders at 5:08 p.m., about 3 hours and 19 minutes later. I had already had Guardsmen on buses at the Armory ready to move to the Capitol. Consequently, at 5:20 p.m., less than 20 minutes, the District of Columbia National Guard arrived at the Capitol and were being sworn in by the United States Capitol Police. We helped to establish the security perimeter at the east side of the Capitol to facilitate the resumption of the joint session of Congress. In conclusion, I am grateful for the Guardsmen from the 53 states and territories who supported the District of Columbia National Guard Operation Capitol Response and helped to ensure a peaceful transition of power on January 20th. In particular, I am grateful for the timely assistance from our close neighbors from Virginia, Delaware, and Maryland National Guard, who augmented D.C. National Guard forces in establishing the security perimeter. I am honored to lead these citizen soldiers and airmen. These are your constituents, many of whom left behind their families, careers, their education, their businesses, to help ensure the protection and safety of the United States Capitol and those who serve in it every day. Thank you for the opportunity to brief you today, and thank you for your continued support of the National Guard. I look forward to any questions you may have. Thank you again.
Thank you, General Walker. Thank you for your testimony. And again, I know I speak on behalf of everybody in this joint committee room that we fully support the men and women of the National Guard and appreciate your work on that day and continue to appreciate the service you're providing to your country and protecting the Capitol as well as our country. So thank you again. General Walker, I want to start my questioning by going back in time a little bit prior to the events on January 6th. So my question is, in June of 2020, as violence was escalating during the summer protest, were you able to immediately receive approval from the Secretary of the Army and the Secretary of Defense to deploy National Guard to assist law enforcement at that time?
Senator Peters, I was. Yes, sir. The Secretary of the Army was with me for most of that week. He came to the Armory. I was in constant communication with him when we were not together.
So you were immediately able to receive approval in June of 20. From your testimony, I want to be clear. Were you able to immediately receive approval from the Secretary of the Army and the Secretary of Defense to deploy the National Guard on January 6th?
No, sir.
In your opening remarks, you said that a January 5th memo was unusual. Could you explain to the committee why it was unusual and what was the impact of the memo that you received on January 5th?
So the memo was unusual in that it required me to seek authorization from the Secretary of the Army and the Secretary of Defense to essentially even protect my guardsmen. So no civil disturbance equipment could be authorized unless it came from the Secretary of Defense. Now, the Secretary of the Army, to his credit, did tell me that I could have force protection equipment with the guardsmen. So we did have helmets, shin guards, vests. We did have that with us, but that came from the Secretary of the Army. The Secretary of Defense told me I needed his permission to escalate, to have that kind of protection.
That kind of protection, even though you would be engaged in force protection, that to protect your men and women, before you could do that, you would have to get approval from the Secretary of Defense?
The memo from the Secretary of Defense made clear that I needed his permission to have, so what it says, without my personal authorization, the District of Columbia National Guard is not authorized the following: to be issued weapons, ammunition, bayonets, batons, or ballistic protection equipment such as helmets and body armor. Now, again, to be clear, the Secretary of the Army told me to go ahead and issue that equipment. So we never were going to have weapons or ammunition, and we no longer have bayonets. But we do have ballistic protection equipment, helmets, body armor. And so I did have that with each guardsman.
Thank you, General. So, but that was unusual, as you mentioned, to have that kind of request. You were on the January 6th phone call at 2:30 that we heard from our previous hearing, where the Chief of Capitol Police was making an urgent appeal for help. And we heard that the D.C. Metro Police Chief said it was a tepid response. He was shocked by it. What happened on that call? What was your recollection of the call, and were the assessment of the two individuals I mentioned, was that your assessment as well?
Yes, sir. So that call came in. It was we actually helped facilitated the deputy mayor from the District of Columbia, and Dr. Rodriguez, Chief Conte, Chief Son later joined the conversation, and we dialed in the senior leadership of the U.S. Army. And at that time, Chief Conte and Chief Son passionately pleaded for District of Columbia National Guard to get to the Capitol with all deliberate speed. So the Army senior leaders did not think that it looked good, it would be a good optic. They further stated that it could incite the crowd. So their best military advice would be to the Secretary of the Army, who could not get on the call. So we wanted the Secretary of the Army to join the call, but he was not available. We were told that he was with the Secretary of Defense and not available. But the Army senior leadership expressed to Chief Conte, Chief Son, Dr. Mitchell, the deputy mayor, and others on the call that it would not be their best military advice to have uniformed guardsmen on the Capitol.
So during the call, you're saying that optics was raised on that call specifically. So I want to go back to the question I started. You said that you were able to get immediate authorization in the summer of 2020 during those protests. General Walker, was the issue of optics ever brought up by Army leadership when the D.C. National Guard was deployed during the summer of 2020? Was that discussed?
It was never discussed the week of June. It was never discussed July 4th when we were supporting the city. It was never discussed August 28th when we supported the city.
Did you think that was unusual?
I did.
So let's put in context. You, in your opening statements, you mentioned the National Guard troops that were ready to go. You had them back at the Armory. How many folks were in the Armory ready to go once the order was given, and at what time were they ready to go?
So I had them ready to go shortly after the phone call. So I brought, at 1500, I directed that the quick reaction force that was based at Andrews Air Force Base leave the base, get to the Armory at all deliberate speed. I had a police escort bring them to the Armory. They returned to the Armory in about 20 minutes. So we had them sitting there waiting. And then in anticipation of a green light, a go, we put guardsmen on buses. We brought them inside the Armory so nobody would see them putting on the equipment and getting on the buses. And then we just waited to get the approval. And that's why we were able to get to the Capitol in about 18 minutes.
What time were they on the buses, ready to go? Do you recall?
Before 5 o'clock. But at 5 o'clock, I decided, hey, you know, there's got to be an approval coming. So get on the buses, get the equipment on, get on the buses, and just wait. And then a few minutes after that, we did get the approval. I was on a secure video conference when the Army leadership conveyed to me that the Secretary of Defense had authorized the employment of the National Guard at the Capitol. So my timeline has 1708, 5:08 p.m. is when we wrote down that we had approval, and that was about 8 people in the office with me when I got that.
How many guardsmen were ready? You said right immediately, earlier in the afternoon.
About 155.
So you could have sent 155 much, much earlier. What would have been the impact of sending those 155 right around that 2 o'clock time frame?
Well, based on my experience with the summer, and I have 19 years, I have 39 years in the National Guard. I was in the Florida Guard, Hurricane Andrew. I've been involved in civil disturbances. So I believe that number could have made a difference. We could have helped extend the perimeter and help push back the crowd.
Ms. Sanborn and Ms. Lova, last week we heard from former law enforcement officials who stated that a lack of intelligence reporting was the main reason for Capitol Police not being fully prepared for the January 6th attack. My question to both of you, yes or no, would you agree that the intelligence community failed to sufficiently identify the threat and warn the Capitol Police of a plot to breach the Capitol, that a plot that was planned in public and announced in advance in a number of open sources?
I think this is on. I'll start. I wouldn't necessarily categorize it that way, sir, but I will tell you, I think you've heard us say before, there's not an agent that wouldn't want more tools in their toolbox. There's not an analyst that wouldn't want more intelligence, and I think I just paint a quick picture for you. The challenges we're faced are the immense amount of rhetoric out there, and what we're trying to separate is aspirational from intent, and combine in order to get to that intent, we're really thinking about private communications and oftentimes encryption. And so I would say that what we are faced with is the challenge of the amount of data and then really trying to find, because of the volume and because of private communications, intent that then would have given us the intelligence picture potentially to shed light on what some of the plans and intentions, indicators and warnings, as our military folks might say.
Ms. Lova, quickly, please.
Yes, sir. I will defer to you, Senator, your colleagues, and other oversight entities such as this one to actually determine what went wrong on January 6th. I don't feel I'm empowered or have enough information to declare whether or not this is an intelligence failure. I do know, however, it was not a success, and we will do everything we can to make sure that what we know is better distributed and understood by our partners, and to echo the Bureau's point, we will also do more to better understand how we can identify the next steps that we see in social media with this particular threat.
Well, clearly, we have to do a much better job, and I'm sure this will be explored in depth in questioning from my colleagues here. Chairwoman Klobuchar.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I want to start by asking you the same questions I asked our witnesses last week, and that is that based on what you know now, including the recent Justice Department indictments, do you agree there is clear evidence that supports the conclusion that there was those who planned and coordinated the attack on the Capitol on January 6th? Does everyone agree with that? Yes, no?
We are seeing indications from our charging documents of people that coalesced together before and made some plans.
Okay, so everyone is a yes on this? Do someone want to say if they're a no? I don't want to call on everyone. Are you all a yes?
Yes, yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay. Then would you agree that it involved white supremacists and extremist groups, the planning? Is everyone a yes on that?
Ma'am, I just say that we're seeing a wide range of involvement and still a lot left to be identified, right? A lot of these.
No, does it involve white supremacists, and that's what I'm asking?
Some.
Extremist groups.
Some.
And was the event not planned by Antifa?
At this point, we have not identified a specific individual that we've charged associating or self-identifying with Antifa.
Okay, thank you. And would you all agree that what happened was a highly dangerous situation that had the potential to be much worse if it wasn't for the heroic actions of the frontline officers?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
thank you. All right. General Walker, I'm going to start with you. I wasn't going to start here, but I am after what I just heard. So Chief Conte had said that he was stunned at the response from the Department of the Army when former Police Chief Sund requested assistance from the Guard. What's your reaction to what Conte said? Were you frustrated on that call as well?
Yes, I was. Senator Klobuchar, I was frustrated. I was just as stunned as everybody else on the call.
And I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, that with the National Guard, it is much better to prepare them and call them into action and have a plan, which I know that I heard from Mr. Celestis that people tried to do. They called the chief, they called people and said, do you want to have the Guard mobilized? And there was a discussion between you and Sund leading up to January 6th in which this was discussed, and you didn't get a clear direction to have them mobilized. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. So I talked to Chief Sund on Sunday. I talked to him Saturday and Sunday. We talk. We're friends. I've known him for a long time. So on Sunday, I asked him, are you going to request D.C. National Guard help? And if you do, I need it in writing. It has to be formal because the Secretary of Defense has to approve it. He told me he was not allowed to request the support. And I asked him if he wanted me to share that, and he said, no, I can't even ask you for the support, is what he told me. But he did say, but if I do call you, will you be able to support me? I said, yes, but I have to get approval from the Secretary of the Army and ultimately the Secretary of Defense because it's a federal request.
Exactly. And so as we've heard from Chief Sund last week, he had been denied by the Sergeant at Arms, and that's a subject for last week. But the subject for today is, given all that, and we know we would have been in much better shape if they'd been called in ahead and if he'd had authority, but now we're to the day, and it is 2:22, and you are on the phone with them, and you're asking for this authorization, which you felt it was unusual to get. Is that right? Unusual that
I thought the delay was unusual.
Yes.
And so we were already in support of the Metropolitan Police Department. And when the Metropolitan Police Department left the traffic control points, what I wanted to do was take those guardsmen and move them to the Capitol immediately. And my logic was we were still in direct support. We would have been in support of the Metropolitan Police Department, who was supporting the United States Capitol Police at that point.
So I just keep imagining the scene. The whole country, the whole world is seeing this on TV. You've got the police line breached at this moment. You have smashed windows. You have insurrectionists going through the police lines. You are on the phone. Everyone is seeing this on TV, and they're not immediately approving your request. And in your recent testimony, you just said, hey, I could have gotten them on those buses and ready to go. Is that correct?
That is correct, Senator.
And as you just testified in response to Senator Peters, you believe that would have made a difference to have them at the perimeter in a sooner point. And I know that the people in charge of Capitol Security felt the same.
Yes, ma'am.
And so you could have had them there earlier, hours earlier, if it had been approved. And then you had them on the bus. And so they were actually sitting on the bus for a short period of time, right, waiting because you thought, well, they've just got to honor the request. Is that how your head was working? So you actually put them on the bus so they were ready to go, but you couldn't let the buses go?
Yes, Senator. I just came to the conclusion that eventually I'm going to get approval, and I didn't want, and at that point, seconds mattered, minutes mattered, and I needed to be ready to get them there as quick as possible. So I already had District of Columbia National Guard military police vehicle in front of the bus to help get through any traffic lights. Mm-hmm. So we were there in 18 minutes. I arrived at 17:20.
Okay.
So, yeah, and they were sworn in as soon as they got there, and they made a difference, according to the Capitol Police.
Well, according to a lot of us. And I just keep thinking of the hours that went by and the people who were injured and the officers whose lives were changed forever. A lot has been reported about the quick response force that was waiting at Andrews Air Force Base to be deployed to D.C. just in case. Now, that force was set up as additional troops to support the Guard's traffic control mission is needed. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And the quick response force couldn't be deployed to the Capitol immediately once the violence began because they were not outfitted for riot control. Is that right?
No, ma'am. They were outfitted. So
Yep.
The quick reaction force was District of Columbia Air National Guard Security Forces Squadron. Most of those guardsmen are law enforcement officers in their civilian positions.
Got it.
So they were ready to go, and they were outfitted with all the equipment that they needed.
And they were out at Andrews.
They were at Andrews. And I just took it upon myself to move them without permission. I just moved them to the armory so they would be closer as well.
Okay. And who was on that conversation with you? You mentioned from the Defense Department. I know who was on there from the police in D.C.
So Lieutenant General Michael Flynn, he was the chief. He was in charge of operations for the Army. The director of the Army staff was on the phone, was on the call. Lieutenant General Pyatt. There were other senior civilian leaders from the United States Army, and other high-ranking general officers were on the call as well.
Okay. And do you remember who was mostly talking about the optics, the questions that Senator Peters asked you, and their concern about that?
Yes. So during the phone call with the District of Columbia leaders, the Deputy Mayor, Chief Son, Dr. Rodriguez, who was talking about optics, were General Flynn and General Pyatt. And they both said it wouldn't be in their best military advice to advise the Secretary of the Army to have uniformed Guards members at the Capitol during the election confirmation.
Thank you. Mr. Salas, could you explain why they would say such a thing? I know you were not on the call, and you were the one that they sent here on behalf of the Defense Department, but you were not on the call. And so do you have any idea why this delay occurred when, as Senator Peters has well pointed out, it didn't occur in other incidences?
Senator, as you point out, I was not on the calls, any of the calls.
We know that.
Okay.
That's why I spent my time talking to someone who was.
Right. However, Senator, in preparation for the hearing, I have had the opportunity to talk to General Walker. I've had the opportunity to talk to General Pyatt and other general officers on the Army staff. I've also had the opportunity to talk to Secretary McCarthy in preparation for the hearing so that I could understand the details of the...
Okay. So just if you could answer my questions, there's so many of my colleagues waiting, why this happened.
General Pyatt told me yesterday that he didn't say anything about optics.
Maybe he meant he didn't use the word optics, or are you saying that General Walker, who just testified that they were concerned about this, is wrong, or that?
General Pyatt told me yesterday, Senator, that he did not use the word optics.
I think that I'll let General Walker answer this, but I think what he's talking about is the general concern of that, was that they were more concerned about how this would appear, and it was in their best advice. And I guess what bears out his testimony is that they did not send the National Guard there for hours. They didn't give the authorization for him as he waited with his troops to go over to the Capitol.
Senator, in fairness to the committee, General Pyatt is not a decision maker. The only decision makers on the 6th of January were the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of the Army, Ryan McCarthy. There was a chain of command from the Secretary of Defense to Secretary McCarthy to General Walker. That was the chain of command. There's lots of staff that was involved in obviously having discussions, but to be clear, on that day, that was the chain of command.
Just could I give General Walker, I think we should give him a moment to respond here, and then I'll be done.
Yes, Senator. So the chain of command is the President, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of the Army, William Walker, Commanding General, District of Columbia National Guard. Can I just make a correction? I said Lieutenant General Mike Flynn. It was Lieutenant General Charles Flynn.
Got it.
And so I just
right.
wanted to correct that.
Okay.
But there were people in the room with me on that call that heard what they heard.
Okay. We'll have to follow up with more questions. I appreciate your testimony. Thank you.
Ranking Member Portman, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Chairman Peters, and thanks to our witnesses. General Walker can continue to talk about your recollection, if you don't mind. This morning, you have testified that you received this letter from Army Secretary McCarthy on January 5th, so just the day before the attack on the Capitol. In that letter, did Secretary McCarthy prohibit you from employing the National Guard's Quick Reaction Force without his authorization?
So I have the letter in front of me, and his letter does not, but it is the Secretary of Defense says that I have to use it as a last resort. But the Secretary of the Army told me, and it's I have the letter, that I could not use the Quick Reaction Force. I would just read it.
Yeah.
I withhold authority to approve employment of the District of Columbia National Guard Quick Reaction Force and will do so only as a last resort in response to a request from an appropriate civil authority. Yeah. I will require a concept of operation prior to authorizing employment of a quick reaction force. Now, a quick reaction force normally is a commander's tool to go help either a civilian agency, but more typically to help the National Guardsmen who are out there and need assistance.
Yeah, I think it's the very definition of a quick reaction force to be able to react quickly. And
Sir.
when you've got to go through that kind of an authorization, including coming up with a concept of operation before the Secretary or, as you say, the Secretary of Defense, so the Secretary of the Army or Secretary of Defense would approve deployment, seems to me to be contrary to the whole concept of a quick reaction force.
And just to be clear, the Secretary of Defense said I could use it as a last resort.
Last resort, right.
But the Secretary of the Army says that I could only use it after he gave me permission, and only then after a concept of operation
Right.
was.
And we talked about the chain of command earlier, so your chain of command is both of these gentlemen. In other words, you didn't have the authority to deploy that quick reaction force based on either the letter or the earlier memo that went from the Secretary of Defense, Acting Secretary of Defense, to the Secretary of the Army. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I also thought it was odd, and I think you said it was unusual and very prescriptive, that the January 5th letter required the Secretary of the Army to approve the movement of deployed guardsmen from one traffic control point to another. Did you find that unusual?
19 years, I never had that before happen. So on that day, the Metropolitan Police, as they would any other day, requested that a traffic control point move one block over. No traffic was where they were, so they wanted the traffic control point to move one block. I had to get permission. I told him, I'll get back to you. I contacted Lieutenant General Pyatt, who contacted the Secretary of the Army. I had to explain where that traffic control point was in relationship to the Capitol, and only then did I get permission to move the 3 National Guardsmen supporting the Metropolitan
These are
Police
3
Department.
unarmed National Guardsmen who are helping with traffic control, in part so that Metropolitan Police can do other things, and they were not permitted to move a block away without getting permission from the Secretary of the Army. Is that true?
That's correct.
Yeah. And then on your testimony, you also talk about riot gear. That January 4th memorandum from Acting Secretary Miller to the Army Secretary required the personal approval of the Secretary of Defense for the National Guard to be issued riot gear. Is that correct?
That's correct. But the Secretary of the Army told me to go ahead and put it in the vehicles.
Yeah.
So I give him credit for that.
Yeah, and you said that earlier. You gave him credit for saying at least to have it there so it was accessible.
Yes.
But still, you couldn't prepare for a civil disturbance without getting permission from the Secretary of the Army and the Secretary of Defense. Is that true?
Normally for a safety and force protection matter, a commander would be able to authorize his guardsmen to protect themselves with helmet and protective equipment.
Well, as I said earlier, I'm disappointed we don't have someone from DOD who actually was there at the time. I think you're being put in a tough position, Mr. Salas. But, Mr. Salas, I have to ask you, why did the Department of Defense impose these restrictions on General Walker's control of the National Guard on January 6th?
I apologize. I got it now. Senator, Secretary Miller wanted to make the decisions of how the National Guard was going to be employed on that day. As you recall, Senator, the spring events, there was a number of things that happened during those events that Secretary Miller, as the acting secretary.
Yeah, well, clearly he wanted to. The question is why and how unusual. Don't you think that's unusual based on your experience at DOD?
Senator, there was a lot of things that happened in the spring.
But don't you think that was
criticized
unusual?
for? No, sir, if I could, Senator, civil disturbance operations, that authority rests with the Secretary of Defense. So if somebody is going to make a decision about employing military members against U.S. citizens in a civil disturbance operation.
Well, let's talk about the quick reaction force then. Again, you've got a lot of experience, looked at your background. We appreciate your being here. Again, you weren't making any decisions that day. They kind of put you forward here as the person to answer questions. But based on your discussions with individuals, but isn't the purpose of a quick reaction force to quickly react to unfolding situations?
Senator, it is designed to do that.
Isn't requiring a pre-submitted concept of operations antithetical to the idea of enabling quick reaction?
Again, Senator, I would call our attention to the quick reaction force that day was designed to respond to the traffic control points in the metro stations. We did not have a quick reaction force to respond to the events that unfolded on the Capitol.
Well, I don't know that that's true. General Walker, did you not have a quick reaction force as part of the D.C. Police? I think you did. You had police officers who were also guardsmen who were involved in your quick reaction force, correct?
I did.
And wouldn't they have been appropriate to respond to the attack on the Capitol?
In my opinion, they would have been.
I don't know. Look, I wish we had the people who were making the decision, Mr. Salas, and I don't want to put you in this position, but you're all we've got in terms of talking to DOD today. In your opinion, did the attack on the Capitol constitute a last resort?
The last resort, you mean an immediate response, sir?
No. Remember, in the letter, it said only as a last resort. Do you think a last resort situation occurred when there was an attack on the Capitol?
There was certainly a last resort situation that occurred, sir.
So why did it take the Department of Defense so long to authorize the use of the National Guard, in particular, the use of the QFR?
Obtained from my discussions with the personnel that were involved that day. And if you'd like to go through the timeline or just answer the question based on why the decision makers, in this case Secretary McCarthy, if we go through the timeline, clearly at 2:22 has been mentioned today. Secretary McCarthy at 2:30, as I pointed out in my oral statement, went down and saw Secretary Miller at 2:30. At 3:04, Secretary Miller made the decision to mobilize the entire National Guard. That meant that he was calling in all the National Guard members that were assigned to the D.C. National Guard. At 3:04, that decision was made. Between that period of time, between 3:04 and 4:10, basically, Secretary McCarthy had asked for, he wanted to understand, because of the dynamics on the Capitol lawn, with the explosives that obviously shots had been fired, he wanted to understand the employment of how the National Guard was going to be sent to the Capitol, what their missions were going to be. Were they going to be clearing buildings? Would they be doing perimeter security? How would they be equipped? He wanted to understand how they were going to be armed, because obviously shots had been fired. He was asking a lot of questions to understand exactly how they were going to be employed here at the Capitol and how many National Guard members needed to be employed on the Capitol.
Let me just say, with all due respect, and my time is coming to an end, 3 hours and 19 minutes, 3 hours and 19 minutes from the first plea, really, with his voice cracking with emotion, as the Major General said. You have Chief of Police, son, saying, help, we need help, now, 3 hours and 19 minutes. And that can't happen again. You agree with that?
Senator, I do.
Thank you.
Very good. Ranking Member Blunt.
Thank you, Chairwoman. General Walker, if the restrictions on your authorities hadn't been put in place by DOD, what would you have done when Chief Sun called you at 1:49 on January 6th with an urgent request for National Guard assistance?
I would have immediately pulled all the guardsmen that were supporting the Metropolitan Police Department. They had the gear in the vehicles. I would have had them assemble in the armory and then get on buses and go straight to the armory and report to the most ranking Capitol Police officer they saw and take direction. And further, just let me add this. So one of my lieutenant colonels on his own initiative went to the Capitol anticipating that we were going to be called. So he would have been there, and he met with Deputy Chief Carroll of the Metropolitan Police Department, who asked him, where is the National Guard? How come they're not here? And this colonel said, well, I'm sure they're coming, and I'm here to scout out where they're going to be when they get here. So that was the plan. I would have sent them there immediately. As soon as I hung up, my next call would have been to my subordinate commanders, get every single guardsman in this building and everybody that's helping the Metropolitan Police, remission them to the Capitol without delay.
And how quickly do you think you could have had people here? I think you said a minute ago that the Guard had moved from Andrews to the Armory here by 3:30. Is that right?
Yes, sir.
And how quickly was the colonel here that was...
He came with the police. So
he was here immediately?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. He was here immediately. When the Metropolitan Police left some of the traffic control points, my colonel left with them and came straight to the Capitol, anticipating that that's where the fire was and that fire needed to be put out.
Well, there certainly was concern here immediately. In fact, yesterday I saw a message that I sent Mr. Elder, who was the director of the Rules Committee for me when I was chairman at the time, and the quote on that message, that text message, was, could this information about the Defense Department and the National Guard possibly be true? That's 309, already wondering where Senator Klobuchar and I and other senators were. Could it possibly be true that the Defense Department was not sending the Guard immediately? Mr. Salasys, on the January 5th letter, that's described as Secretary McCarthy relaying new restrictions from the acting Secretary of the Defense, Christopher Miller. Would that be accurate? Would those be new instructions? And do you agree that General Walker had more flexibility before those instructions than he did after? I think that's a yes or no. do you agree he had more flexibility before those instructions than he did after? That would be one question. And two, would it be fair to say those were new instructions or not?
Sir, Senator, General Walker, in fairness to him, can't respond to a civil disturbance operation without the authority of the Secretary of Defense. So, absent these memos, General Walker would have had to get approval to respond to the Capitol through the Secretary of Defense.
Well, let's talk about that approval process. I think you said it a minute ago to Senator Portman, if you'd like to go through the timeline. I assume you're talking about the Department of Defense timeline that I have in front of me. You mentioned 1504 as one of your reference points. At 1519 or 319, that timeline says the Secretary of the Army phone call with Senator Schumer and Speaker Pelosi about the nature of Mayor Bowser's request. Secretary of the Army explains Acting Secretary of Defense already approved full DC NG, full DC National Guard mobilization. Would that be right as of 319?
That would be accurate, but if I could clarify what mobilization is.
Let me go one step further, and I'll let you do that. At 1526, 326, Secretary of the Army phone call with Mayor Bowser and Metropolitan Police Chief relays that there is no denial of their request and conveys Assistant Secretary or Acting Secretary of Defense approval of the activation of full National Guard. So on your timeline, within 7 minutes, one is mobilization, the other is activation. Go ahead and explain what those two things mean.
So, Senator, those words are being used interchangeably. What Secretary Miller did at 1504 on 6 January was authorize the mobilization or activation of the National Guard, the D.C. National Guard. All that does, sir, is provide for the National Guard to be called in from wherever their homes are to come to the Armory. That's what the mobilization activation order was.
I wonder if that's what I wonder if that's what Senator Schumer and Speaker Pelosi thought it meant. Now, you can't answer that, only they could. And I also wonder if that's what Mayor Bowser thought it meant when they were told at 319 and 326 that the Guard has been mobilized and the Guard was being activated. I don't expect you to be able to answer what they thought. I know I would have assumed that that meant the Guard was on the way unless I was specifically told, well, they're mobilized, but they really won't be there until we make a decision hours later. At 4:32, the Acting Secretary of Defense provides verbal authorization to remission D.C. National Guard to conduct perimeter and clearance operations. So that's 4:32. That's an hour and 10 or so minutes later. Is that the moment when the Guard was told they could move forward?
Yes, Senator, it is.
Do you agree with that, General Walker?
No, sir. So I didn't get approval until a little bit after 5, and I got that from the Secretary of the Army, who was relayed to me. I never talked to Secretary of Defense Miller, and I didn't talk to the Secretary of the Army. Army senior leaders told me at about 17:08, 5:08 p.m., that the Secretary of Defense has authorized our approval to support the Capitol.
So, Senator, if I could, in fairness to General Walker, too, that's when the Secretary of Defense made the decision at 4:32. As General Walker has pointed out, because I've seen all the timelines, he was not told that till 5:08.
How is that possible, Mr. Salazar? Do you think that the decision in the moment we were in was made at 4:32 and the person that had to be told wasn't told for more than half an hour after the decision was made?
Senator, I think that's an issue. There was decisions that were being made, there was communications that needed to take place, and then there was actions that had to be taken. All of that was happening at simultaneous times by different individuals, and I think that part of the challenge is that some of the delayed communications probably put some of the challenges that we had that day.
Well, I would think so. If you have to have the communication before General Walker and the National Guard can take the action, and the communication doesn't occur for over half an hour, it's a significant problem for the future if we don't figure out how the decision, the communication, and the action all happen as nearly to the same time as they possibly can.
I agree,
thank
Senator.
you, Chairwoman.
Thank you very much. Senator Hassan.
Well, thank you very much, Chairwoman Klobuchar and Chair Peters and our ranking members Blunt and Portman for this hearing. And I want to thank all of our witnesses for being here today, and I want to thank you all for your service to our country. I want to start with a question for Ms. Myslova, please. It's about a topic that I asked about last week. The Secretary of Homeland Security has the authority to designate events with national significance as national special security events, and these designated events receive expanded federal support for event security. Factors used to determine national special security event designations include the attendance of U.S. officials, as well as the size and significance of the event. In our hearing last week, the former officials in charge of security here at the Capitol testified that DHS did not reach out to U.S. Capitol officials about designating January 6th joint session of Congress as a national special security event. So, Ms. Myslova, to your knowledge, did any Department of Homeland Security officials ever consider or recommend designating the January 6th joint session of Congress as a national special security event?
Sorry. Thank you, Senator. No, to my knowledge, no one at the Department of Homeland Security did consider designating January 6th as an NSSC. Also, to my knowledge, no one responsible for protecting the Capitol asked for such a designation.
Right, but when we're talking about an NSSE, you don't need a request from the Capitol, correct?
That is correct.
You could have DHS could have initiated it. So what is the department's current policy and process for designating national special security events? And were there any procedural issues blocking such a designation in spite of the growing evidence of intelligence available to federal security officials prior to the event?
I'm sorry, Senator. I am running currently the Office of Intelligence and Analysis for DHS. We have a small role in the NSSC process, but I am not qualified to speak about the whole process. It's fairly complicated. I'm happy to have Secret Service reach out to you, ma'am, if you'd like me to follow up with that.
Well, I think it's really important for us to understand what the processes are. We had, as has been pointed out, the Vice President-elect, all members of Congress in one location at an event where there was clear intelligence that might turn violent, and there appears to have been no communication or effort by DHS to designate this in a way that would have had this security that we're now standing about stood up ahead of time in an effective way. So I look forward to following up with you on that. I want to turn to Ms. Sanborn now. According to a recent report, the FBI has currently charged 257 people associated with the events on January 6th. Of the individuals charged to date in relation to the attacks of January 6th, how many were already under investigation by the Bureau?
Ma'am, I'd have to get you the specific number, but I can only recall from my memory one of the individuals that was under investigation prior.
And was that because the FBI is limited in its tools or capacity to monitor, charge, or arrest these individuals prior to January 6th? Was this a manpower issue? I'm just trying to understanding, looking back now, what might have made a difference in being able to move against some of those individuals sooner?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think it's twofold. So it's the complexity of trying to gather the right intelligence that helps us predict indicators and warnings. And I spoke earlier about, while there's a volume out there of rhetoric, trying to figure out that intent is very challenging for us in the intel community because it happens on private comms and encryption. So that's one aspect. And then the other aspect is, of the people that we were investigating, so predicated investigations, we don't necessarily have the ability to mitigate the threat they might pose by travel if we don't have a charge. And so I think you're tracking that we were aware of some of our subjects that intended to come here. We took overt action by going and talking them and trying to get them to not come, and that worked in the majority of our already predicated cases.
Okay, thank you. I'd look forward to following up with the FBI more about that. I also have another question for you about the FBI's information sharing practices. On January 5th, the FBI Norfolk Field Office issued a report that some extremists were preparing to travel to Washington and commit acts of violence. That report eventually made it to a U.S. Capitol Police analyst, but it didn't make it to the former Capitol Police Chief, Mr. Sund. So I think it's important for us to understand whether this was a failure in information sharing policy or practice. What's the standard policy for disseminating reports like that?
Yes, ma'am, that's a great question. I'd just like to segue into that part of the reason we were able to get that intelligence report from the Norfolk office is because we made it a national collection priority for all 56 field offices to collect whatever they could on the joint session as well as inauguration. And so when they collected that information, they did follow our normal process, and I think we heard yesterday from the director, and went above and beyond that process. So they documented it quickly within the situational information report, and they disseminated it 3 different ways: in writing, via email, verbally, and then also put it in what we call the LEAP portal, which is available to all state and local partners across the United States.
So I'm trying to understand, though, how it didn't get elevated or communicated to the highest level. Who was the highest official in the FBI to be informed of the intelligence?
So I, similar to Director Ray, found out about it days after. And so I think it's very important to also caveat what that was. It was raw, unvetted information, and only because of the collection message did it get as quickly elevated to the Washington field office and disseminated to the task force officers. So thousands and thousands of tips come in just like this on every day, and not all of those get elevated to senior leadership.
Except that this was tips about violence at the United States Capitol, where we were going to have all members of Congress, the current vice president, the vice president-elect. And so given the gravity of the threat, it is very hard for me to understand why somebody didn't pick up the phone. And I'd like to understand, too, whether any of the following were informed of the intelligence: the president, the White House chief of staff, the attorney general of the United States, the speaker of the House, or the Senate majority leader.
Not to my knowledge, ma'am, and I think you heard the director say this yesterday, and I echo it 100%. Anytime an attack happens, we're going back, and we're going to figure out what we could have done better and differently. So I echo there's always processes that can be improved.
Look, I will just say this, that one of the things before a major event that one should always do is figure out who the leadership is, and they should be talking twice a day on the phone for the week leading up at least. That's kind of standard practice, at least in the states that I'm familiar with. It's certainly standard practice for governors. And it is astounding to me that even if it's raw intelligence, given what the stakes were on January 6th, that kind of sharing wasn't routine and that it didn't happen. So I hope very much that we will look back at this and develop kind of standard operating procedures so that the leadership of security at the Capitol, the leadership of security in all the various agencies are sharing this kind of information person to person rather than relying on standard emails and the like. Thank you very much.
I will say that's the purpose of the command post, and but 100% echo your point, which is let's go back and figure out what we could do differently.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Madam
Thank
Chair.
you. Thank you, Senator Hassan. And for members of the Rules Committee, we are following the order set forth by the Homeland Security Committee, how they do their order. So if there's questions about that, that's how we're doing it today. And next is Senator Feinstein.
Thanks very much, Madam Chairman. I'd like to ask this question. In August of 2017, DHS, Office of Intel and Analysis, and the Virginia Fusion Center issued a report days before the violent protests in Charlottesville, Virginia. The report warned that the protests could be among the most violent to date. It warned that anarchist extremists and white supremacist extremists are calling on supporters to be prepared for and to instigate violence at the 12 August rally. Now, this was very similar to what we saw in the lead-up to the January 6th insurrection, when groups were actively planning to come to Washington and commit violence. Yet, there was no similar intelligence report by the Department of Homeland Security for this occasion. My question is why and what happened to change this procedure?
Yes, Senator, thank you for that question. Before the election and then into the inauguration, INA did publish 15 separate unclassified reports that did discuss specifically that there was a heightened threat environment, that the threat could come from lone actors or small cells. We assessed that those that were motivated by concerns about the election and grievances associated largely with COVID-19 restrictions would also appear to be armed. And we also warned that they could transition quickly from a peacetime situation into a violent situation. I actually, in preparation for this hearing, did review all of those reports and was impressed with how well the team did. They were very well written and very specific. The point, Senator, is that we thought we had provided that warning. We did not have anything specific about an attack on the Capitol to occur on January 6th. So we did not issue a separate report. In hindsight, we probably should have, but we had just issued a report on December 30th with our colleagues at FBI and the National Counterterrorism Center. Well, we had thought, ma'am, that was sufficient.
Yeah, I'd like to ask that you make those reports available to this committee.
Happy to, ma'am.
Please. Also, press reports indicate that Acting Defense Secretary Christopher Miller issued a memo on January 4th preventing the D.C. National Guard from receiving weapons or protective gear, interacting with protesters, or employing riot control agents without his personal authorization. Do you know of any other instance where a defense secretary required personal authorization before allowing National Guard troops to respond to an emergency? And I'd like to put the letter from Christopher Miller, Madam Chairman, in the file, if I could.
Yes, without objection.
Could someone answer that question?
I'm sorry, Senator. I'll answer that question. I was waiting. Senator, I'm not aware of another letter from a secretary. But again, based on events in the spring and Secretary Miller being new to the department at that time and some of the things mindful that had happened, he issued that direction. That direction, though, again, I'd come back to the point that in order for National Guard members to deploy in civil disturbance operations, it requires the Secretary of Defense's approval. So just as, to be clear, there is no ability for the military to respond without the Secretary's approval for civil disturbance operations.
Well, if I may, Madam Chairman, I'm looking at a memo for Secretary of the Army, employment guidance for the District of Columbia National Guard, dated January 4, 2021, I received it, and it responds to a memorandum regarding the district's request for support for the planned demonstrations from January 5th to 6th, 2021, and you are authorized to approve the requested support subject to my guidance below, subject to consultation, and then it points out a number of things that are not authorized. So this letter of January 4, I'd like to be in the record because somewhere there's a problem here. And I've been listening carefully, trying to find out what the problem is, but there were certain reports that just were not issued, and they were of an intelligence nature. And I'm curious about finding out which ones essentially did what. So if you have any response to that, other reports, and could let this committee know, it would be appreciated.
Yes, ma'am, happy to do so. I think the key here is, and I think my DHS colleague mentioned this, is the intelligence we had articulated that we knew people were coming to the D.C. area. We knew there was a possibility they would come armed and potentially have conflict amongst themselves. What we lacked, and I think you heard this last week from all the folks that testified as well, none of us had any intelligence that suggested individuals were going to storm and breach the Capitol, and that was the intelligence that we lacked.
Well, I think that remains to be seen, but I appreciate the comment, and I think that's what this committee has to look for and make a determination whether there was, in fact, adequate pre-question, pre-interest, and there is a record, and I thank you, Madam Chairman.
Thank you.
Senator Johnson, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I get into my line of questioning for today's subject, Ms. Smyslova, I received, when I'm sitting here in the hearing, a press release from Capitol Police that said that we have obtained intelligence that shows a possible plot to breach the Capitol by an identified militia group on Thursday, March 4th. Is that a threat that you're aware of?
Senator, we issued a bulletin last night, co-authored with the FBI, about extremists discussing March 4th and March 6th. Is that what you're referring to? It's a joint intelligence bulletin we released last night around, it was very late, midnight, I think. Yes.
Okay. Well, again, so the threats are ongoing.
Yes.
General Walker, to review the timeline, at 1:49, Chief Sund contacted you. At 2:15, the Capitol was breached. I think in your testimony you said you had available 340 D.C. National Guard troops. Is that correct?
Well, sir, it was actually half of that. So half were on the streets helping the Metropolitan Police Department. The other half would have came in to relieve them. But we would have called them in to come in.
Okay. So you had 40 in the quick reaction force, correct?
Yes, sir.
So had you been able to, had this all been pre-approved by the Secretary of Defense? And I'm mindful of the considerations of having military involved in civil disturbances, and I think that's part of the issue. Some of the blowback that occurred with the spring instances. How quickly could have you gotten how many people to the Capitol?
20 minutes.
How many people?
150.
Okay. I think that's important information to have. I think, quite honestly, what we need to do here is we need to completely reconstruct what happened. And I mean completely reconstructed. We need to obtain eyewitness testimony from different vantage points, from different perspectives, and that's certainly what I've tried to do. Ms. Sanborn, how many points of confrontation occurred during the riot? I mean, in other words, were these primarily at choke points, doors, windows that were breached, and then inside the Capitol, again, outside the House chamber? Or was there the Capitol is 751 feet long. Was this a 751 long line that Capitol Police and other law enforcement were battling protesters?
Thank you for the question. I think we're still in the process of gathering that data. Obviously, the folks that we have charged, we've charged for breaching and getting inside, and so we at least know that at some point they got through a choke point. The actual distance of how long that was is still part of what we're examining, sir.
Okay, but we've got all kinds of video, all kinds of photographs, so you obviously are examining that, and from that video, you've been able to arrest 300 people. 300 people have been charged. 18 have been charged with conspiracy. 40 have been arrested for assault on law enforcement officers. So have you, looking at those videos, maybe not been able to identify the people, but have you counted the number of people that you want to identify, for example, that will probably be charged with assault?
So we're still doing that, and that number increases just like the arrests every day, and so far we have identified hundreds of people that we're trying to still identify.
Okay, well, again, we've got 300 individuals who have been charged, 40 have been charged by assault. Do you expect the hundreds of people to be charged with assault, or will those be disorderly conduct, unlawful entry? I mean, Give me some sort of sense of the extent of this.
Absolutely, it's a fair question. So I think the charges have ranged from everything from trespassing to obstruction to definitely assault on federal officers. We have a fair number of those. And so the charges based on the actual behavior that the individual partook that day definitely vary.
How many firearms were confiscated in the Capitol or on Capitol grounds during that day?
To my knowledge, we have not recovered any on that day from any other arrests at the scene at this point. But I don't want to speak on behalf of Metro and Capitol Police,
Okay.
but to my knowledge, none.
So nobody's been charged with an actual firearm weapon in the Capitol or on Capitol grounds?
Correct. The closest we came was the vehicle that had the Molotov cocktails in it, and when we did a search of that vehicle later on, there was a weapon. But
How many shots were fired that we know of?
I believe the only shots that were fired were the ones that resulted in the death of the one lady.
Okay. Well, again, I appreciate the chair's comments about a bipartisan, nonpartisan investigation here, seeking out the truth. That's what I'm trying to do. Cognizant of how I was reacted to by offering an eyewitness account at the last hearing, I'll risk entering another piece of reporting into the record. This is from the New York Times. Hopefully that'll be viewed more favorably. The title is A Small Group of Militants, Outsized Role in the Capitol Attack. In that report, it says federal prosecutors have said members of the Oath Keepers militia group planned and organized their attack and, quote, put into motion the violence that overwhelmed the Capitol. The reason I'm entering this in the record and read that quote is that it really does seem to align with the eyewitness account that I read portions of in the record last week. No conspiracy theory, just an eyewitness account from a knowledgeable observer. I didn't get to the point of the actual attack, and I want to just read a couple excerpts. This is the title, Provocateurs Turn Unsuspecting Marches into an Invading Mob. And again, these provocateurs are primarily white supremacist groups. Then a loud bellowing shout from behind, quote, forward, do not retreat, forward. Then two other men standing across from one another on the high granite curbs on either side of the footpath bellowed variations of forward, do not dare retreat. Some made direct eye contact at people and pointed directly at them as if trying to psych them into submitting. A third man standing on a chair also shouting forward, reached down and grabbed me by the shoulder and barked, don't retreat, get back up there. It wasn't an expression of enthusiasm or solidarity. It sounded like a military order. And it wasn't from a wild-eyed kid. This guy was probably in his 50s. He looked furious with me. Nobody seemed aware the Capitol was physically under attack. The tear gas caused pandemonium. But there was still no stampede, and people helped create or widen paths to allow others to leave the area. Then from the north, a column of uniformed, agile younger men walked briskly, single file toward the inaugural stand. They came within 2 feet of me. Their camouflage uniforms were clean, neat, and with a pattern I couldn't identify. These were the disciplined, uniformed column of attackers I had seen. There were a good 3 dozen of them moving in a single snake-like formation. They were organized, they were disciplined, they were prepared. We're taking the Capitol, the first or second announced. You're going to get arrested, someone called. Ms. Sanborn, does that tie into with what you're uncovering as you investigate exactly what happened in the Capitol that day, that you had these armed militia groups that had conspired and organized to be there, maybe dozens, we don't know how many, but that they were organized and knew how to use the mob to storm the Capitol? Is that kind of what you're seeing?
We definitely so far are seeing a mixture of that, absolutely. We're seeing people that got caught up in the moment, got caught up in the sort of the energy, et cetera, and made their way into the Capitol, and those are probably the ones that you're seeing the charges simply of trespassing. And then we're definitely seeing that portion that you're pointing out, which is small groups and cells now being charged with conspiracy that coalesced either on site or even days or weeks prior and had sort of an intent that day, and they, too, probably caught people up in the energy.
So just one final comment. I would urge anybody that criticized me for entering an eyewitness account in the record last week to please read the eyewitness account to take a look at actually what the truth is. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I call on Senator Merkley, I just want to ask you, Ms. Samber, one thing. These people that were assaulting the Capitol in military gear and were pinning an officer between a door and were using bear spray on officers in the Capitol, would you title them provocateurs?
Ma'am, it would all depend on the evidence behind the case, right? So as we're going through and we're figuring out what actually we know about each individual, it would just depend on what the facts and what we know holistically about that to be able to put a label on it.
Do you think there were some very serious, violent people involved in this insurrection?
100%. A lot of officers were injured and a lot of damage was done.
And would you describe the atmosphere as festive?
Absolutely not.
Thank you. Senator Merkley.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all for your information. Assistant Secretary Salisis, if I understood your earlier comment, you thought the quick reaction team was only for reinforcing assistance to those members of the National Guard providing traffic control. Did I hear your comment correctly?
Yes, Senator, you did.
Thank you. Major General Walker, I believe that if I heard your comments correctly, that quick reaction team was there to respond as needed, including protection of the Capitol. Is that correct?
No, Senator. So they were actually to provide support to the guardsmen out there. What I would have wanted to do was remission them and get them to the Capitol immediately as a quick reaction force.
I see. So they weren't necessarily planned to help protect the Capitol, but you would reassign them to that in that type of emergency?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I was really struck by the complexity of the chain of command for trying to get a decision for response. It starts with the Capitol Police Board, which goes to the Chief of the Capitol Police, Stephen Sund, who goes to the Commanding General of the D.C. National Guard, who goes to the Secretary of Army, who then consults with people within Department of Army about whether it's appropriate, which then goes to the Secretary of Defense, who then consults Christopher Miller to decide to study that, who then gives an order back to the Commanding General of the D.C. National Guard. This six-step process seems totally unsuited to the situation of responding quickly to an emergency. And just wanted to ask you, Commander Walker, if I'm reading this chain of command correctly, and do you share the view that this is way too complex for a moment when you need to respond quickly?
So, Senator, it's a long-standing process, but it can work in minutes. So, for example, during the first week of June, the Secretary of the Army was with me. I watched him call the Secretary of Defense and consult with the Attorney General and respond back to me with a approval within minutes. So it's an elaborate process, but it doesn't always have to be. When in extremist circumstances, we can get it done over the phone very quickly.
If I understand right, it's normally an elaborate process done in advance, and in fact, the information came to you on January 1st. You got back a response on January 5th, so this was before January 6th, but it had this provision that this restriction that I think you've testified to was unusual, that required reconsultation on January 6th in a fashion that deeply inhibited the ability to move quickly.
That's right, Senator.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to turn to Undersecretary Smyslova. And you've been with the department for how long?
17 years, sir.
For 17 years, and I think you were the Deputy Undersecretary on January 6th, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, I was struck by different reports that came from officials saying that there was a mood within the department, and I'll just quote one formal official report, quote, "Nobody wanted to write a formal intelligence report about this, in part of the fear that such a report would be very poorly received by the MAGA folks within DHS." And to follow this up, Brian Murphy, former head of DHS, and I don't know, were you also the deputy to him as well?
I was one of his deputies, yes, sir.
He noted that DHS officials had ordered him to stay away from the threat of white nationalism, that Chad Wolf, Ken Cuccinelli, also had asked him to modify intel assessments to ensure that they matched up with public comments by President Trump to downplay the threat posed by white supremacists. In your time at DHS, it's very important that intelligence is unaffected by politics. It's like the root information. Did you get a sense that there was kind of a troubling cloud, as reported in various sources, including from the former head of DHS, that there was this troubling cloud of political influence over the quality or the kind of determination of how intelligence was presented to officials?
I can say that INA's reports did not change. We did not change our assessments based on any political pressure or interference. We did publish the Homeland Threat Assessment. It's a publicly available document that does state that white supremacists are the most persistent and lethal threat to the homeland.
So did you ever feel any pressure or receive any encouragement, even kind of in a less informal way, I'm not talking about a written document, that you needed to be very careful about clarifying the threat posed by white extremists?
I did not personally receive that.
And do you consider Brian Murphy's report that that type of pressure was applied to be accurate or inaccurate?
He has, his is a whistleblower complaint, and it is still being adjudicated.
No, I understand, but I'm asking you, you were right there in the leadership. You never got a sense that there was any type of political influence like he reported regarding encouragement to downplay?
I did not personally have that influence pushed upon me, sir.
Okay, thank you. Some have suggested that the reason that there were formal intelligence assessments regarding earlier events, including the protests in Portland, but not such a detailed presentation related to January 6th, was because of this pressure to downplay to some degree the threat posed by white extremists.
I would like to point out, sir, that the two instances are very different. Our support during some of the civil unrest and the protests, specifically in Portland, were at the direct request of our own DHS federal law enforcement partners. And in that capacity, we were reacting to a pattern of violence that had shown itself for several weeks. Our open source team did an excellent job in many instances of providing specific information that kept those officers safe. They were reporting things like bricks may be used today as a weapon, another day it might be bug spray combined with leaf blowers or lasers. Our work, by contrast, leading up to the election and January 6th is quite different. It's a different kind of an environment. There's not that pattern of violence. It is a different kind of assessment. So I do suggest, sir, that it's impossible to compare the two.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator. The chair recognizes Senator Sinema for your questions.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being here today. During last week's hearing, we heard about coordinated security planning efforts between law enforcement and federal partners for January 6th, including areas where planning could be improved. As part of this conversation, the committees heard about intelligence shared by the FBI field office in Norfolk, Virginia on January 5th, warning of extremists preparing to travel for, quote, war. We also heard from the former chief of U.S. Capitol Police that he never saw this report and that on January 6th, he knew of no intelligence suggesting there would be a coordinated violent attack on the U.S. Capitol. The head of the FBI's Washington field office has previously said publicly that the Bureau did not have intelligence suggesting the rally would turn violent prior to the January 5th report. However, on January 8th, a podcast from the New York Times outlined activity across multiple social media platforms showing coordination between groups ahead of the January 6th attack. The podcast highlighted social media conversations about coordinating travel, bringing weapons, and using language like occupy the Capitol and the revolution will come to Washington. So my first question is for Ms. Sanborn. Was the FBI aware of these specific conversations on social media?
To my knowledge, no, ma'am, and I would just sort of articulate why that is. So under our authorities, because being mindful of the First Amendment and our dual-hatted mission to uphold the Constitution, we cannot collect First Amendment protected activities without sort of the next step, which is the intent. And so we'd have to have an already predicated investigation that allowed us access to those comms, and or a lead or a tip or a report from a community citizen or a fellow law enforcement partner for us to gather that information.
So the FBI does not monitor publicly available social media conversations?
Correct, ma'am. It's not within our authorities.
So my next question is for Ms. Sanborn and then Ms. Slaslova. Did the preparations for January 6th rally follow the typical process for sharing information among law enforcement entities when confronted by this type of an event with a high potential for violence? And were there additional processes implemented to consider that, as Senator Klobuchar pointed out, this was an event with Congress in session and the Vice President and Vice President-elect all gathered in one place?
Yes, ma'am. So a couple of things we did different than normal operations is we sent out and made this a national priority for all of our 56 field offices to actively go out and ask sources, collect information on any threats that posed to the National Capital Region, not only for the 6th, but for the inauguration. That tasking is what led to the potential collection in the Norfolk field office. We also, a step we took that is different than our normal every course of day of business is both Washington field office and headquarters stood up command posts. So we activated our NC3, which is a multi-agency task force that was 24/7 inside the Hoover building, inside SIAC, and Washington Field mirrored that in their field office.
And ma'am,
Yes.
Yes, ma'am. And DHS also, INA, had been on a heightened period of alert before the election and then after the election. We also participated in the command posts in the Washington the Washington Fusion Center. In retrospect, we may have been better off if we had considered sending out some kind of a terrorism bulletin, but we did not do that before January 6th.
So, and this is a follow-up question for both of you. The FBI field offices did have intelligence outlining a threat to Congress. We know that conversations were happening on publicly available social media, and DHS was tracking the travel of some of these suspected radicals. So given all of these pieces, what, in your opinion, broke down, and what got in the way of law enforcement properly planning to meet these publicly articulated threats?
I'll start. I think exactly the processes we had in place, we followed, and I think that's the good news. I think, as you heard the director yesterday, and I would echo, anytime there's an attack, we in the FBI want to bat 1,000, and we want to not ever have this happen again. And so we're asking ourselves exactly the questions that you're asking. Is there a place that we could have collected more? Is there something that we could have done? And so that is exactly what we're looking back at. I think that the information we had, we worked quickly to try to get that out in reporting and share it in multiple ways, verbally, email, putting it in portals, et cetera. But 100% you can rest assured we're asking ourselves the same, as we want to continue to improve and get better.
And ma'am, we also at DHS are completely dissatisfied with the result of our efforts leading up to January 6th. We are re-examining how we distribute our information, how we coordinate with our partners. We thought that it was sufficient, and clearly it was not. We are also working much more focused on applying more resources to better understanding this particular threat. We also are looking at how we can better understand social media to get those tips and maybe get better insight into what this adversary is doing. This is a very difficult threat for us and the intelligence community to understand. It will require more partnerships with non-traditional partners and with our standard state and local partners, and you will see that we will reinforce our already good partnership with the FBI. We will do better.
Well, thank you. Following up on that last comment around local partnerships, I wanted to go back to Ms. Sanborn. On January 5th, the FBI did receive information that armed protests were being planned at Capitol buildings in all 50 state capitals. Could you just briefly, in the time we have left, share how that intel was acted upon and how it was shared across the country?
Ma'am, I don't recall off the top of my head. I'd have to get back to you on the mechanism that we did to share that information.
So based on that response, would it be fair to assume that it was not a particularly high priority, that there were armed protests planned at all 50 state capitals across the country?
No, it 100% was a high priority, and it definitely, for our mission and our focus, we were not on the 6th only focused on the National Capital Region. We were focused on the whole country, and so it 100% was a very important focus for us. I just can't remember the mechanism of the document or whether it was an email, whether it was a joint product, how we passed that